Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of my vlog. Today is going to be a dorkier vlog, hooray! Sometimes these ones are my favorite ones to do though. Today we're going to be talking about basically the history of recorded music over the last 100 and something years, specifically the various formats that were used for home consumption of music. Uh, there have been a few over the years. In fact, there have been a ton, and I'm only going to cover the ones that were quite successful because those are the only ones I have examples of. I'm not going to go deep into the wild, somewhat experimental formats that never really took off, just the popular ones. So people have been trying to record music for more than 150 years now. So the earliest recorded music that exists is from the 1850s from a system called the phonautograph. Now, that wasn't intended at all as a system for recording music. It was just, I forget who the man who created the system, what his name was, but he basically devised this system where there'd be basically a pen on paper that was suspended by a device so that when he would talk into it, it would like sort of scribble down the basically the exact waveform of the noise he was making. Although it wasn't super exact, it was a fairly finicky process. The only reason he did that was just to see what an audio waveform looked like. Thought that might be interesting, and it was. And so it basically just created a piece of paper with some fairly wobbly writing on it. That was the earliest visual example of what sound looks like in a weird way. But fast forward to more than 100 years later, someone came across these old phonautograph sheets and thought, I wonder if you could digitize these and actually see what they sound like. So they did a lengthy process to actually go and get and scan them digitally, read the WAV files, and then play them back. And what they got was a totally garbled, but still definitely there, recording of a man singing Eau Claire de la Lune. I'm not going to show it in this video because I don't want to steal other people's cool YouTube content, but I'll throw a link in the description for where you can find the video of the phonautograph working, because it's just incredible to hear someone's voice from 150 years ago, you know? It's wild. But it took about 20 years before anyone figured out that you could actually record music and hear it back. That was Thomas Edison, one of his many inventions, and one of his most famous inventions was the phonograph, which was the system to actually record those little audio waves on wax. I mean, originally he was recorded flat on wax paper, but that wasn't a very good system for, getting it to people, having them use it in their homes. You couldn't hold much on a sheet of paper. So eventually Edison devised a way to record linearly on a wax cylinder. I actually have two of these that I got from the Seattle Antique Store last year. Now, no, I don't have an actual phonograph that can play a wax cylinder, but I have, look at this Blue Amberol record. This is a later example of a wax cylinder. This is from about 1919 or so. This is Off with the Old Love, On with the New by Van Brunt. I want to say it's from 1919. Hey, you know what? That would make this exactly 100 years old. But yeah, so this was the original way that you could get recorded music into homes, starting in the late 1880s, becoming really prevalent in the last decade of the 19th century. So they're linear grooves, so it starts at the beginning, runs as a spiral all the way to the end, and I believe this holds like 3 minutes of music. So now you could record basically a band recording an entire song or someone singing an entire song, mass produce it. Although in the very early days of recording music, if you wanted to like put out, let's say, 1,000 copies of your new single, you had to record it 1,000 times. And that was what professional musicians used to do back then, is lock themselves in a recording studio for a whole day and spend the whole day playing the song over and over so you could get individual records out. And it's those earliest records that are the most valuable because they're a one-of-a-kind performance. But that was very brief before they found out that, no, you can actually just create like a master of this and print from them and print new records. So starting in about 1895, different companies started making flat disc records. I don't have like an original, like early days of disc record. This is the earliest one I have from Grieg's Sonata in C minor. This is from 1923. The earliest record spun between 90 and 100 RPM and were not consistent. In fact, it depended on what company made it. There really wasn't a whole lot of, like, it's not like today where if you buy an album, you know you're able to play it. It's like back then, if you got like a Victrola, you knew you could play Victor records on it. If you got like a French Pathé machine, that you could play their records. But yeah, there wasn't a lot of cross compatibility there. So disc records and wax cylinders coexisted for quite a while. In fact, wax cylinders were the most popular format until about 1912. I have another example here. Again, from about 1919. These are from the tail end of wax cylinders. But, and I like the packaging, hey? The earliest record labeling done on these wax cylinders here. But yeah, by about 1912, the disc-based records overtook wax cylinders. And by the 1910s, it was pretty standardized that one of the flat records would spin at 78 RPM. It would go from the outside in. There are some early records that go from the inside out, but by about 1910, all the companies had their own system, so you wouldn't have to buy a million record players if you wanted to play all the recorded music that was out there. And so by about 1920, actually these bad boys hung on till like 1929 before the Edison company completely gave up and started making disc-based records. The Edison company at least really held on to the wax cylinders. And yeah, but after 1929, they were essentially by the wayside, and people had moved on to these 78s. Now, there were a couple different sizes of these guys. Don't worry, I'm only using these with records I don't particularly care about. Actually, this one's kind of cool, but you can tell they're different sizes. This is a 10-inch one I'm holding here, which was mostly used for pop music and jazz and stuff like that. And they also had the 12-inch. 10-inch could hold about 3.5 minutes per side. The 12-inch could do about 5 minutes per side. These ones they mainly used for classical music. Also, if you're wondering why record albums are called albums, it's because if you wanted a collection of 8, 10, 12 tracks, they would actually put it in like a photo album style thing. So back in the 30s and 40s, this is what an album was. That was all it was. So the thing about these original old school 78s, I don't think any of these are cracked, but it's getting harder and harder to find ones that aren't. See, this one is. But this bad boy is cracked right there. See that? The original 78 RPM records were made with shellac, which is a pretty brittle material. So if you drop one, it will shatter, and that's the way it was then, and it's even more so the way they are now as they're aging and getting older. So you really have to take good care of these records. So throughout the 30s and 40s, that was pretty much the only way to get music was on a 78 RPM disc record. Um, and that was how it stood until 1948. I believe it was Capitol Records that came up with the original microgroove technology, but that was the next step in recorded music for home consumption. The microgroove LP. There it is. There's the LP logo. Long playing record. And this is a Columbia record, but a number of record companies jumped on that pretty quickly. Developed in 1948. So now you could get, like, this is a 10-inch record again, not the 12-inch LPs you're used to. Regular LP is this size, but the original ones from back in 48 were smaller. And they usually held about 4 songs per side. That's 4 short little 2.5 minute numbers per side, just like that. And it used the microgroove technology was just a much finer groove, so you could fit more in a smaller space. And also, it spins a lot slower. These spin at 33 1/3 RPM instead of 78. So that's just another way to cram more sound onto one disc. And the LPs took off. They were pretty successful. Also, the following year, in 49, they transferred the microgroove technology to singles as well. This is an early RCA Victor single. In the early days of the 45 RPM singles, these spin at 45 now, so now we got a third speed in the mix for vinyl. They were color-coded, so I know the red ones were classical. I believe it was blue for jazz and black for pop, but I can't remember. They color-coded the vinyl in the early days, though. You also had EPs. This is a different single. You also had EPs on this 45 RPM format, which is, as you can tell, 2 songs per side, usually. Sometimes they varied. But, so 78s did hold on until about 1959. Remember, if you wanted to play these new microgroove LPs, you needed a new turntable because the 78 RPM records, since they have wider grooves, the needle is way too thick to play these new microgroove records. So you needed a new needle, which meant back in those days there was no such thing as far as I know, you couldn't really interchange needles on the devices, so you needed a new LP turntable. So that's one of the reasons the 78 RPM records hung on another 10 years. Is just, people keep their old technology. People, since the dawn of time, have waited for the new technology to get cheaper before they buy into it, and people have never been too keen to replace their whole collection. So old formats tend to die hard, and the 78s are no exception. They continued to be made and mass-produced until about 1959, 1960, before they were discontinued altogether. And then after they were discontinued, it was all LPs and 45s for the first half of the 60s. That was pretty much the only way you could get music, but they were coming up with new systems. Mainly, they were looking for ways to be able to play music in your car. Now they had the radio, obviously, but they wanted a way for you to buy your favorite albums and just play them on your commute. You can't cram a record player in your car. Every bump you go over and the needle is going to skip all over the place. Not a good system. But in about, I think it was 1952, someone invented the endless loop cassette tape cartridge. And the original endless loop tape was the 4-track tape, which was originally just designed as like a recording device that you could play back. And then later they realized we could put this in cars and put pre-recorded music on these. And so it didn't really rev up till the early 60s, but starting in the early 60s, they were coming up with systems and starting to release pre-recorded music on these 4-track tapes. And then around 1962, maybe 64, Learjet came up with a new system called the 8-track tape, which I have an example of here. This is a 8-track tape cartridge, developed in 65 and quickly overtook the 4-track tape. What it is it's an endless loop spool, so You never have to take it out and flip it. It just plays consistently. So when one track ends, it clicks into track 2 and plays track 2. There's 4 tracks on the tape. So the tape itself is like, I think, about 15 minutes long. You can hold about 15 minutes worth of sound on the tape. But since it was divided into 4 tracks, that became an hour's worth of recorded material. Just the way the tape head read it, it would read track 1 first, then 2, then 3, then 4. And the reason it's called 8-track is because these things are stereo. So for each of the 4 tracks, you've got 2 channels, your left channel and your right channel, making for a whopping 8 tracks of music stored on that tape. And this format started to take off pretty quickly. And by the early 70s, was very popular. Most people who had cars had their 8-track deck, had their 8 tracks in it. It was still a second place market to vinyl. Vinyl was still the number one way to get pre-recorded music, and it was considered to be better quality than 8 tracks, although 8 tracks weren't bad. Just, 8 tracks were the way to do it in your car. The other flaw with 8 tracks is you can't select a song. You can't even rewind. I think eventually they came up with machines way later on that could rewind an 8-track, but pretty much 8-track had one option, and that was play. 2 options if you count track select, because there's 4 tracks on this. So if you wanted to hear your favorite song again, you had to wait up to 15 minutes for the track to get back to that position. So there's quite a few flaws with this system. Also, since each of the 4 tracks had to be exactly the same length, because it's all the same tape, frequently, as you can see here, look at the song Rock and Roll. Rock and Roll starts on track, near the end of track 3. It says beginning, and then track 4 is the conclusion. So what that meant is, at the end of track 3 on this tape, the track would fade out. You'd hear the ka-chunk as the machine selected track 4, and then track 4 would fade back in, and you'd hear that. So I have an 8-track tape deck. I'd love to show you how it works, but the tape deck's not working at this moment, unfortunately. Also, though, in about 1965, the same time that these 8 tracks were being developed, there was another, even smaller, cartridge-based system that was being created around the same time, and this is probably one you're more used to seeing. That's right, the compact cassette. Out of all the formats I'm going to cover today, I think the cassette gets my award for most improved format, because when it first hit the market in about 1965, it was intended for spoken word because the quality wasn't all that good. By the late 60s, they started to release pre-recorded albums on the compact cassette, but it was originally kind of thought of as a cheaper alternative to the 8-track. It did have certain benefits like fast forward and rewind, which was nice. And unlike the 8-track tapes, this one, you just plug it in, plays side 1, you flip it, and you play side 2. None of that endless loop stuff on these bad boys. But these slowly started to gain steam throughout the 1970s. By the late 70s, they were right on 8-track's tail as the number 3 format for pre-recorded music, obviously behind vinyl, which was in the number 1 spot. Now, by about 1980, these had become prevalent enough that they'd knocked out 8-track. These had become the primary format for listening in your car. In 1982, however, there was a new format launched that it was a game changer. It was digital. You know which one we're talking about. The compact disc. And yes, I am using this as an opportunity for shameless self-promotion. Hey, look, it's my new album. Looks like this. Sometimes people forget that compact discs have been around for well over 35 years. 1982, so it's a 37-year-old format that stores, instead of actually storing the waveform that maybe a needle would pick up or a magnet would pick up, this stores little bumps that are invisible to the naked eye, which represent the ones and zeros, the binary. Again, it's fully digital now. You're not going to deal with wow and flutter with CDs, which is when the slight pitch variations you get with pretty much any analog music format. Now you've got it totally basically standardized and very easy to play in a car. However, like all formats, took a while to get started because the original CD players were really expensive and the discs themselves weren't even all that cheap. So vinyl and cassette remained the most popular way to get music for still a couple of years. 8-track faded out pretty quickly though. 8-track was gone by about 84, 85, leaving vinyl, cassette, and CD to fight for the market amongst themselves. So in about 1985, the compact cassette officially passed the long playing record in sales. And they were not ever as good quality sound-wise as vinyl, but by the mid-80s they were starting to get close. Over the 20 years, progressively, the technology got better and better and better on these things. And I have some cassettes from the late 80s into the 90s that actually sound really good. And I have some from the 70s that sound really iffy. That's partially because the technology improved over the years, and partially because my old 70s cassettes are more, literally they're just more worn out. That happens, you know. But yeah, so these were the #1 format, briefly, only for a couple of years before in 88 or 89, somewhere in there, the CD passed this too, and became pretty much the undisputed #1 format for years and years and years for pre-recorded music. But not to this day, because things have really changed. So cassettes, again, like old formats do, held on for a while. The last pre-recorded albums that were released on compact cassette came out in the first half of the 2000s. But by about 2003, no one was selling albums on cassette anymore. Although, in the last couple of years, they're starting to make a resurgence. I went to the local record store in the mall, not even like a record store, like a used record store, like a Sunrise Records, one of those new vinyl retailers that are really starting to pop up now. And they are selling reissues and new albums on cassette. It's the new big thing. I think it all started with the Guardians of the Galaxy soundtrack that they put, what was it, the Awesome Mix or whatever they call it. They put that on a cassette, and I think that started the whole wave, because ever since that album was on store shelves on cassette in like 2015, and now tons of albums on the shelf just on cassette. It's weird to see that come back, but so CDs were the only viable format until in the late 90s. Digital storage of music started to become more widespread, and in 2001 the iPod was invented, and throughout the 2000s that slowly became the way to have music. Everyone had an iPod. I used to have a big old iPod, but I threw it away, so I don't have it as a reference for this video, but that became the way to do music, and iTunes became the way to buy music, and Napster, and LimeWire. Remember those sites? I do. Those became a very popular way to steal music, and that sort of became the culture. Over the years, it became more normal to stream music illegally than to actually purchase it. And it's one of the things people say to this day is the downfall of the music industry, why there's no music industry now, blah, 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 is because online file sharing ruined it. That's a whole nother discussion. That's a topic for a whole nother video. But so CDs, starting in about 2008, 2009, started their downward trend. And slowly everything moved to digital. And over the years, it even became less normal to have an iPod or a phone loaded with music. Nowadays, most people just stream it online. The streaming took over even the digital music, like device storage. You know, you don't load all your favorite albums. You don't buy your albums one by one and load them onto your iTunes or your phone anymore. People do. You still can, but everyone just streams them off of Spotify because Spotify, while not every artist is on Spotify, a vast enough majority is that it's almost all you would really need. There's almost no point in collecting music anymore. It's just all out there. It's all in the cloud. And I think that's why the vinyl LPs have made a resurgence. It's a direct pushback from music consumers against that to say, hey, we want to have a physical copy of an album. We want to be able to look at the cover and read through all the liner notes. We don't want to just look it up on our phone and hit play because we don't really have it. We can hear it, but I don't know. Speaking for myself, I like to have a music collection, and I think I'm not alone in that. I like to have a physical shelf in my room with all the albums that I know and love. And it's counterintuitive in terms of actual convenience. Obviously, it would make more sense to just not have a shelf for music and have more free space, but that's just the way I'm wired. I like to have physical copies of my music. Clearly, a lot of other people do as well, because this is the first or maybe the second year that sales for vinyl have passed sales for CD. Vinyl is the new number one, or at least quickly becoming the new number one format for pre-recorded music, listening in the home, in terms of actually physical formats. It's never going to pass streaming, obviously. So I don't think vinyl has actually passed CDs in terms of physical units sold now, but certainly in terms of dollars and how much revenue vinyl has brought, it's starting to pass CD now. So that's the new thing. We've gone back, we've gone full circle to vinyl. Will we see reissue wax cylinders on the market soon? I'm sure somebody out there already has. I know Cheap Trick put out an album a couple of years ago on an 8-track tape, just as a novelty, so I'm sure all old formats will have their 15 minutes of renewed fame. Cassette is enjoying its right now. And we'll see what comes next for music formats. I would imagine it's going to be all streaming from here on out. I can't imagine there being a new physical music format that people will thrive to get. I always wondered what would come after CDs. You know, we got Blu-ray discs, so I was like, is there going to be like another new wave of discs for music? And people said there would be, but just the digital became so easy, there became no point. So that covers all the musical formats I wanted to discuss, from old to new-ish, if you can call a 1982 invention new. Yeah, thanks so much for watching. As I said, I am also a professional musician. You can find links to where my music can be sold or streamed online, as well as a full list of my tour dates down in the description there. And subscribe to my channel if you're enjoying my videos, and ring that notification bell if you want to be notified every time I upload a new video, which will be tomorrow and every day for the foreseeable future. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to make this vlog series an actual everyday thing, but we're going on 2 months into it, and we have. It's been incredible. I always say we, but it's only ever me. I guess by we I mean me and you, the viewer. Thank you for watching. And yeah, like this video if you like what you saw. More musical content will be coming in the next couple of days. Gonna start hitting up the local open mics and telling you about those in tomorrow's episode. Thanks again so much for watching. I will catch you again tomorrow.